Usually when we hear a word like freedom or emancipation, there is this immediate expectation of like a Hollywood-style happy ending.
Right.
You know the scene. The heavy iron chains fall away, the triumphant music swells, and the person just walks off into a bright, completely unburdened future.
Yeah, the classic cinematic moment.
Exactly. But as you are about to find out today, history rarely writes a clean script. We are doing a deep dive into a word and a concept that seems incredibly straightforward on paper, which is manumission.
Yes.
And that is the formal legal term for the act of an enslaver freeing the people they enslaved. And I mean, it sounds like an act of pure benevolence, right?
It really does, on the surface anyway.
Right. But the stack of sources we are diving into today for you, they reveal something entirely different. Manumission wasn't always a simple act of grace. Often it was a highly calculated tool engineered to maintain control and incentivize compliance within the very system of slavery itself.
What's fascinating here is that as we journey through these sources, we see how different societies essentially built massive, invisible cages to replace the physical one.
Wow.
Yeah. We're going to look at ancient Greece and Rome, colonial Peru, the Caribbean, the U.S., and the Ottoman Empire. And they all engineered highly specific, often rigid rules around who got freedom and exactly why.
Right.
It was almost never just a blank check handed over out of the goodness of someone's heart.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to understand how this actually worked in practice. Where do the earliest blueprints for this concept even come from?
Well, we can trace a lot of the foundational legal blueprints back to the ancient Mediterranean, specifically ancient Greece.
Okay.
And right away, the transaction of freedom was overwhelmingly conditional. It wasn't about an enslaver waking up one day and deciding to, do the right thing.
Sure.
Very often, manumission was deferred entirely until the master's death. It was just written into their wills.
So the master gets a lifetime of free labor, and the enslaved person gets the mere promise of eventual freedom.
Yes, exactly.
Assuming they remain perfectly obedient until the very end, I guess.
Precisely. I mean, it was the ultimate carrot on a stick. There were rare cases where slaves could actually buy their own freedom while the master was alive, though.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a status known as chorus oikointes. We actually have records of two 4th century bankers, Patience and Formion, who had been enslaved before they managed to save enough to buy their freedom.
Wow.
They actually rose to prominence. Or, in even rarer circumstances, the state could step in. Like Athens famously liberated everyone who fought at the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BC.
But wait, if you bought your freedom or won it in battle, what actually happened the next day? Like, did you just blend into Athenian society as a regular citizen?
No,
No?
not at all. That is the crucial catch here. Even when a slave in ancient Greece was freed, they did not become a citizen.
Oh.
They became what was called a metic, which translates roughly to a resident alien. And here, the real tether, their former master, automatically became their prostates.
The prostates.
Yeah, their legal guarantor or guardian.
A guardian. For a fully grown adult who just bought their own freedom.
Yes. The former slave could be bound to continuing duties for the master. And under a practice called paramon, they were commonly required to actually live near their former master.
You're kidding.
No, they couldn't just pack up and move to another city-state to start fresh.
So it's almost like a corporate non-compete clause mixed with a perpetual retainer.
That's a great way to put it.
You get the payout of freedom, but you're still legally tethered to your boss. Like, you can own property, and sure, your kids are born free, but you personally are still trapped in the physical and legal orbit of the person who used to own you.
That is a very apt analogy. It was a mechanism to grant a release without the master losing the social and economic benefits that the former slave provided.
Right.
The master kept the loyalty, kept the proximity, but shed the cost of daily upkeep.
If Greece kept you in this weird legal purgatory where you were a resident alien, did any ancient society actually offer a clean break? Did anyone actually hand over full citizenship?
They did. And we see that shift dramatically when we look at ancient Rome.
Okay, Rome.
Right. So under Roman law, a slave originally had no personhood whatsoever. They were legally categorized purely as property. I mean, literally no different than a cart or a plow.
Wow.
But when a Roman slave was manumitted, becoming a liberatus or a liberta, they actually became a Roman citizen.
That is a massive distinction from Greece. How did that transition from property to citizen actually happen?
Well, the Romans were incredibly theatrical, so it involved a highly specific civic ceremony called Manumission Vindicta.
Freedom by the rod.
Exactly. The master would bring the enslaved person before a magistrate in a really public setting, and a civil servant, a lictor, would step forward with a specific rod called a festuca.
Okay.
The lictor would lay the rod on the slave's head and formally declare them free. Then the master would pronounce, "I wish this man to be free," physically turn the person around in a circle and let them go.
That physical turning around is such a striking visual.
It was very symbolic. And then came an even more potent visual marker, which was the pileus.
The felt cap.
Right, this soft, undyed felt cap. Enslaved people were strictly forbidden from wearing it. But when you were freed, your head was publicly shaved, and you were handed this cap.
So it was an instant signal.
Exactly. Wearing it was a highly visible signal to everyone on the street that you were a free citizen.
I remember reading that the cap actually became the enduring emblem of liberty itself. Like, even the Roman goddess of freedom, Libertas, is depicted holding it. But what really blows my mind about the Roman system is the financial ceiling.
Yeah.
It seems like once you had that cap, the upward mobility was wild. You have characters like Trimalchio from the Satyricon, who was massively wealthy.
The financial ceiling was indeed blown wide open.
Yeah.
Freed slaves were barred from holding the highest public offices or, serving as specific priests. But if they were sharp at business, Roman society placed almost no limits on the wealth they could amass.
Right.
They took their former owner's family name and became a client who still owed social obligations to their former master as a patron, but economically they could completely out-earn them.
Right, because you have historical figures who are the children of freed slaves reaching the absolute pinnacle of society.
Oh, absolutely.
The great Augustan poet Horace was the son of a freedman. The 2nd century Emperor Pertinax was the son of a freedman. That level of generational elite from property to emperor is staggering.
It is staggering, but we must also temper that with the realities of Roman stratification, particularly regarding gender.
Okay.
A freed woman, Liberta, became a citizen, but female Roman citizenship did not grant anywhere near the same rights, independence, or protections as men.
Right, of course.
They were legally prevented from participating in public and civic society, like voting or holding office. So, while Rome offered a very real path to citizenship and wealth, that path was still heavily walled in by the strict patriarchal codes of the era.
So Rome essentially turned freedom into a highly public civic transaction to build a loyal, wealth-generating underclass. But what happens when you fast forward a bit and add the Catholic Church into this equation?
Yes.
Does introducing religious morality actually make the system of manumission more humane or just better at hiding its cruelty?
That takes us to colonial Latin America, specifically Peru. And the short answer is that the system becomes deeply entangled with the church and incredibly effective at hiding deeply hidden family secrets.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In colonial Peru, the legal framework was governed by the Siete Partidas, which is an old Castilian law code. This code explicitly demanded that freed people honor and obey their former masters for giving them such a, well, they called it a generous gift.
So we are back to that mandatory gratitude we saw in Greece.
Yes. The most straightforward way for enslaved people to gain freedom there was through a practice called courtation. This is essentially a formalized installment plan.
Right.
An enslaved person could literally negotiate a purchase price with their enslaver and buy their freedom over time, piece by piece.
Okay, buying your own freedom over time makes logical sense from an economic standpoint. But the sources spent a lot of time on something called baptismal manumission. How did that work?
This is where it gets incredibly complex. Enslavers would bring enslaved infants to the baptismal font and formally grant them their freedom right in front of the priest.
Okay.
On the surface, the paperwork frames this as a beautiful act of religious mercy and Christian charity.
Wait, hold on. They freed the infant, but the sources say the mothers were almost never manumitted alongside their children.
Exactly.
Labor-wise, what is the strategy there? You have a free baby living in the quarters of an enslaved mother. That sounds like a chaotic household dynamic. Wasn't this essentially a hostage situation disguised as a holy gift to ensure the parents' loyalty?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was exactly that. A brilliant and terrible hostage situation.
Wow.
A child who was freed at baptism but continued to live with their enslaved family was at a much higher risk of simply being re-enslaved later on.
Oh, because they're right there.
Yeah, because their Carta de Libertad, their freedom paper, wasn't always enough to protect them from a corrupt system. Freeing the child was a very effective, deeply manipulative way for owners to guarantee the absolute obedience and loyalty of the still enslaved parents.
Right, because the parents wouldn't dare run away or rebel if it meant leaving their legally free child behind in the enslaver's household.
Precisely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The sources point out a very stark demographic difference between the enslavers who were doing this.
Yes.
Female owners who freed slaves at baptism used very intimate, affectionate language in the legal records. They would write things like, "For the love I have for her," but male owners almost never used that kind of language. Why the massive difference in tone?
The reason for that absence of affection in the written record is quite dark. Many of the children being manumitted at baptism by male owners were, in fact, the owner's own illegitimate, unacknowledged children born to enslaved women. So the male owners would characterize the manumission purely as an act of generous Christian beneficence. This allowed them to free their own biological children without ever having to publicly admit to the sexual exploitation of the enslaved mothers.
That is just staggering hypocrisy.
It completely masked the biological reality of the situation under the guise of piety.
Using the church font to launder your own secrets, and we see a similar chaos with deathbed manumissions in Peru, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Slave owners frequently used their last will and testament to free people, often citing a desire to die with a clear conscience.
Right.
Under Ibero-American law, a person had absolute discretion over 1/5 of their estate, meaning they could free a certain number of enslaved people without legally disinheriting their spouse or children.
Okay.
But these deathbed manumissions were incredibly messy in practice. Greedy heirs would constantly dispute the wills. They would claim fraud or argue that the enslaved person had manipulated the owner when they were in a weak mental state.
Because the heirs are suddenly watching their inheritance, their property, literally walk out the door.
Exactly. The courts usually respected the wills, but the heirs fought tooth and nail to prevent the loss. And even when the freedom was granted, it was often conditional.
Always strings attached.
Always. The will might stipulate that the freed person was legally obligated to care for a surviving elderly relative of the master until that person died. So even from beyond the grave, the strings are still attached.
Peru seems so heavily driven by guilt, religious optics, and family secrets. What happens when you strip the religion and the guilt entirely away and freedom becomes a purely financial equation?
Then you arrive in the Caribbean and North America.
Okay.
Here, the bureaucracy of freedom was dictated by raw economics, red tape, and the shifting tides of agriculture, and it was often punitively expensive. Take the island of Barbados as a prime example.
What were they doing?
If an owner wanted to manumit someone, they couldn't just declare it. They had to show cause to the local authorities and pay an exorbitant fee to the state. It was £200 for a male slave and £300 for a female slave.
£300 in the colonial era. That is an astronomical sum of money.
It was a fortune. I mean, it was a legislative wall designed specifically to make legal freedom mathematically impossible for the vast majority of people. The state wanted to ensure that no freed person could ever become a financial burden on the parish, so they just priced freedom out of existence.
But people still found a way. The sources highlight this incredible woman, Susanna Ostrahan.
Oh, her story is amazing.
She was an ex-slave in Barbados who essentially built an entire business empire as a huckster and a trader for one singular purpose. She navigated that oppressive financial hurdle, scraping together those massive 200 and 300-pound fees specifically to buy her own family members and friends out of the system.
Her story is a remarkable testament to human resilience. She understood that the system only spoke the language of capital, so she mastered that language to save her loved ones.
Yeah?
The psychological and financial toll of having to buy your own family from a government that views them as livestock is difficult to fully comprehend, and it varied wildly by geography, too.
How so?
Well, contrast Barbados with Jamaica, where manumission went largely unregulated until the 1770s when they started requiring bonds. Even without the massive fees, freedom in Jamaica was incredibly rare.
Really?
Yeah, one study estimates only 165 slaves won their freedom that way around 1770. But those who did manage it formed the foundation of the free population of color on the island.
How does the timeline in the United States compare to that Caribbean model? Did we see that same reliance on massive fees and bureaucracy?
The United States shows a fascinating and, well, ultimately tragic evolution based almost entirely on the shifting needs of agriculture. In the early colonial days, you do see isolated instances of maneuverability. We have records from 1661 in New Amsterdam of a freedwoman named Rachel Angola.
Right.
She became the first black person to individually petition a legislature asking for the manumission of her adopted son. Or figures like Anthony Johnson in the 17th century, who gained his freedom and actually became a prosperous landowner in Virginia.
So there was some early flexibility.
There was, but as the plantation economy solidified, the laws aggressively locked down.
Right, because if you are building an economy entirely dependent on mass unpaid labor, you can't have people legally opting out of it.
Precisely. By the early 1700s, laws were passed stating slaves couldn't be set free at all unless for meritorious services that had to be personally judged by the governor.
Wow, making it almost impossible.
Exactly. But then we see a massive pivot in the late 18th century in the Upper South. Planters were transitioning away from labor-intensive tobacco cultivation.
Because it depletes the soil, right?
Yeah, tobacco aggressively depletes the soil. So they moved toward mixed crop farming, like wheat and corn, which simply require far less year-round labor.
Okay.
Suddenly, these planters had a surplus of enslaved people that were expensive to feed in-house.
So what does this all mean? Did the laws change just because the crops changed?
They absolutely did. Virginia repealed those harsh restrictions in 1782, suddenly allowing masters to free slaves of their own accord. And we see a massive spike in manumissions because of that.
Really?
Yeah. Robert Carter III, a wealthy Virginian planter, emancipated almost 500 slaves, starting in 1791. The proportion of free black people in the Upper South jumped from less than 1% to 10% in just 2 decades.
It is incredibly cynical. Morality essentially took a backseat to profit margins.
It really did.
When tobacco stopped paying the bills, suddenly enslavers found their conscience. But knowing American history, I'm assuming that window didn't stay open for long. What flipped the economics back?
One single invention, the cotton gin, in 1793.
Ah, of course.
Before the gin, cleaning short staple cotton by hand was so incredibly slow that it wasn't a profitable mass crop. The cotton gin mechanized the cleaning process. Suddenly, vast new expanses of the Deep South could be cultivated for cotton, and it became wildly, unfathomably profitable.
Right.
The bottleneck was no longer cleaning the cotton. The bottleneck was picking it. The demand for slave labor skyrocketed overnight, and as a direct result, the rate of manumissions plummeted.
But was it purely just greed driving the lockdown, or was there something else at play?
It was a potent mix of greed and sheer paranoia. The Haitian Revolution, which successfully overthrew the colonial government and freed enslaved people, sent shockwaves of absolute terror through American slaveholders.
Oh, I bet.
That fear of armed uprising was compounded domestically by the 1831 rebellion led by Nat Turner.
So they realized that a growing population of free black people living right next to an enslaved population undermined the entire psychological control of the system.
That was exactly their fear. In response, Southern states panicked and passed laws making manumission virtually impossible. In South Carolina, you needed explicit permission from the state legislature just to free one single person. In Florida, they eventually prohibited manumission altogether. The legal door to freedom was slammed firmly shut, and it stayed that way until the 13th Amendment in 1865.
So in the Americas, we see freedom heavily dictated by the soil, the crops, and the fear of revolt.
Yeah.
Was there anywhere in the sources where freedom was restricted purely by demographics, like specifically by gender?
Yes. For that, we have to look at the Ottoman Empire, which presents a deeply troubling dynamic. Under their policy, guided by interpretations of Islamic law at the time, the manumission of male slaves was actually quite common and culturally encouraged.
Okay.
But the manumission of female slaves was tightly, aggressively restricted, and the demographic reality of this is stark. Across centuries of the Islamic Empire's slave trade, the ratio was roughly 2 females traded for every 1 male.
2 women for every man. Why the massive disparity, and why hold the women back from the freedom that was being offered to the men?
The sources are very clear on the reason. It was explicitly about concubinage and domestic sexual slavery.
Oh, I see.
Sexual slavery was a central, lawful pillar of the Ottoman slave system. Even outside of explicit concubinage, most female slaves were forced into domestic occupations, working in private homes and harems that implicitly included sexual relations with their masters.
That's horrifying.
It was the most common motive for purchasing female slaves, and tragically, the primary motivation for retaining them and refusing them, the manumission that male laborers might eventually earn.
But wait, in the 19th century, wasn't there a massive international push to end this? Didn't Europe start forcing the Ottoman Empire to sign all these anti-slavery treaties. I'm thinking of the Firman of 1830 or the 1889 Canonim or the 1890 Brussels Conference Act. Did international treaties actually change the culture on the ground, or do they just force the exact same atrocities to operate in the shadows?
You hit the nail on the head. They changed the optics, but not the reality. The public face of the empire agreed to suppress the trade to appease European powers, but a massive clandestine market simply sprang up.
So it just went underground.
Completely. Gangs organized illegal imports. The taking of women and children as spoils of war officially lessened on paper, but it didn't stop in practice. We see this horrifically illustrated as late as the Armenian genocide in 1915, where Armenian girls were systematically sold into slavery despite vehement public denials by the government.
That's chilling to think of that happening in 1915 in the era of photography and modern warfare.
It forces us to confront how deeply entrenched these systems of human commodification really are. Turkey didn't even ratify the League of Nations Convention on Suppressing Slavery until 1933, and even then, illegal sales of girls were still being reported in the shadows.
Wow.
They didn't adopt explicit ironclad legislation prohibiting slavery until 1964.
1964. We have listeners whose parents were alive in 1964. That is practically yesterday in historical terms.
It really is.
As we pull all of these incredibly heavy threads together, I think there is a profound realization for you, the listener, to take away from all this. We started by noting that manumission sounds like an absolute good.
Right.
But historically, it was almost always a lever pulled by the powerful to serve their own interests. It was a mechanism designed to extract a final ounce of value. It was taxed as a revenue stream in Rome.
Yeah.
It was weaponized to control parents through their children in Peru. It was priced entirely out of reach by the bureaucracy in Barbados. It was halted the moment the cotton gin made human labor too profitable in America. And it was categorically denied to women in the Ottoman Empire to perpetuate domestic exploitation. Freedom, in the context of manumission, was rarely a clean break.
This raises an important question, and it's the final thought I'd like to leave you with today.
Right.
When we look at the historical fine print of manumission, the exorbitant government fees, the lifelong legal tethers, the rules keeping a person bound to their former master, we have to ask ourselves something.
Swap.
In what ways do modern societies still practice conditional freedom today? How often do we celebrate the lifting of a visible chain while entirely ignoring the invisible financial, legal, or systemic strings that immediately take its place?
That is the exact question we need to be asking, because history isn't just about memorizing what happened centuries ago. It's the lens through which we understand the mechanisms of power operating around us right now. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives you think you know, and we'll see you next time.